Hello everybody and welcome to the Coopersmith review video for PSY 204 Educational Psychology. We've got a much longer study guide in the materials, but I am going to be focusing in this review on our end of course review document, which contains the essentials, and perforce it's kind of barren in terms of explanation and information, and that's why we're kind of using this video to supplement that. Before we start, and I'm going to be using different sources as we move along, I want to look at what educational psychology is, and I'm going to be using some different websites. This is from careerinpsychology.org to kind of discuss what educational psychology is. And what they say over here is that educational psychology is the study of how humans learn and retain knowledge, primarily in educational settings like classrooms. Doesn't necessarily only mean elementary schools or kindergartens or like they have in the pictures, and you think of educational psychology as applying to little children in elementary schools. It's not necessarily true. It also applies to colleges, and the educational psychology is geared towards children from infancy to adolescence, and it also applies to adults as well. Certainly continuing adult education programs and things like that are much more common and much more easy to establish now that we have the internet than it was many years ago. In fact, you might actually probably are an adult, and you might be going back to school or changing careers or whatever it is. Educational psychology certainly applies to every element of teaching and pedagogy, whether you're talking about children or you're talking about adults. Of course, we need educational psychology because teaching people and knowing what ticks is hard. When you have individuals who are knowledgeable and maybe have an easy time with math, having them now go ahead and focus on dealing with people who have a lot more trouble with things like math it's a hard thing to do. And therefore we have educational psychologists who study these aspects. What makes people tick, what makes people want to learn, and what makes people actually retain information. And educational psychologists can conduct research and studies that are relevant to education in terms of trying to figure out, okay, many different people are trying many different tactics. There are millions of schools worldwide, and people are doing everything known to man, and okay, well, somebody's got to study and say, okay, what worked and what didn't work. These are things that educational psychologists look at. They try to figure out what has worked, why did it work, how can it be translated to other areas, and these and many more things discuss or illustrate what educational psychologists do. And that's where we segue to our first slide over here, the role of educational psychology, which it provides teachers with research-based principles that guide their teaching. As I just mentioned a moment ago, when you talk about studying things and how well they've done, research methods by which things can be studied, are the key to being able to reproduce things and being able to not only establish what works based on theories and based on maybe anecdotal evidence or individual practices, but also based on the numbers. This kind of teacher, this number of students, if I can show that classes with 20 students did 23% better than similar classes with 30 students, well, then maybe I can make I can establish a conclusion that it's more likely that smaller classes will do well. On the other hand, if I do the same kind of study in a similar type of class and I realize that there was no discernible difference, then I might go back to the drawing board and say, well, this thing about having smaller classes may not be that relevant. Now, of course, you have to be kind of cautious. You don't want to draw incredibly broad ranging effects from individual studies. There could be fluky data. There could be, as like statisticians would tell you, you have to separate the data from the noise because there are going to be variances in studies regardless. Not every study is going to be perfect, but the more studies you have in something, the bigger the sample size, the better the quality of the study, the more likely it is to establish a conclusion that you can then go ahead and use. So that leads us to our next question. Okay, what makes a good teacher? After all, the entire idea of educational psychology is to be a better teacher. And again, we're not specifically talking about elementary school teachers or lower level teachers. We're talking about pretty much everybody here. Knowing the subject matter, that is a prerequisite to be a good teacher. You can't teach math if you don't know math, obviously. It's not quite as important as maybe some people think it is. There are many colleges that go on the idea that if you're a great scholar in a particular area, you're going to be the best teacher. That, as we know, is not necessarily true. We've all had teachers in elementary school or high school or whatever it is who were geniuses in the subject and knew everything about the subject but weren't necessarily the best at giving it over. In fact, sometimes, obviously, people, they know the subject so well that it's hard for them to envision anybody not knowing it that well, and that kind of interferes with their ability to do well. But still, knowing the subject matter is, of course, a prerequisite to being able to teach it. Mastering teaching skills. Teaching skills is not just an innate ability. There are particular skills, some of which are covered in this course, in terms of being able to be an effective teacher. Having a mentor, having somebody who can help you, sometimes called an intentional teacher or intentionality. The idea of having somebody who has experience in the field being able to give over information is important. Ability to use 21st century skills. Teaching is a lot different now than it was even 20, 30 years ago. In the old days, you'd have an old schoolhouse where you had one room and you had children of every age, and it was very hard to teach there. They figured out a way to do it, and they made it work because they had no other choice. Then they had bigger schools and more subdivided classes, and now the amount of utilities or the amount of tools that are out there that are usable by teachers to be more effective in and out of the classroom are absolutely incredible. 21st century skills, I mean, there are virtually an unlimited number of skills that can be used using 21st century technology, but here are some examples from Edutopia about some of the characteristics of a 21st century teacher in terms of the idea that things are different both in terms of technology and also in terms of thought. The thought process in terms of what makes a good teacher has also changed a lot, completely aside from being able to leverage all the technology that exists to be better teachers. Learning-centered classrooms. There's the idea of this quote-unquote flipped classroom model. Well, actually, that's number 2, really, is the flipped classroom model. But number 1 is the idea of the learner-centered classroom, personalized instruction, the idea of trying to break it down. Again, in the old days, you just didn't have the financial wherewithal or the technological wherewithal to establish as much individual instruction. Now you have a little bit more of the ability to do so. Having the students produce things, giving the students on their devices or or PowerPoint or whatever it is, by giving them the ability to lead by, rather than just regurgitating information, being able to produce things. Learning new technologies, of course, is very important. Being able to understand how text messaging and video recording and even virtual reality now, as it's becoming more and more common, being able to leverage that to teach well is, of course, important. Being able to look at other cultures, other countries, not only for their cultures, but also for their ideas in terms of what they've tried and what's worked. Use phones. The idea that children, even if the children don't necessarily own a smartphone, they may own other devices, or they may have devices at home. Being able to use these and leverage these certainly is very important. It's not necessarily required, but if you can do things like get people involved in terms of having a texting group and having people to participate that way, having an app or using a pre-existing app. It doesn't mean you have to develop it yourself. Using a pre-existing app, these are things that could help. Blogs and going digital, all the same basic idea, getting your information out there. Collaboration is an interesting idea in that it really allows the students to be part of the learning experience rather than just being on the recipient end. There are message board apps, there are texting group apps, there are all sorts of different apps that allow people to be much more interactive than they used to. Twitter chat, these are all things that are the same basic idea, where you're establishing collaboration and getting to students in a way that was impossible in the old days and could be very, very helpful. And a lot of these are in the same idea until we get to the last to the last few. The last two are the idea of not being fixed in the methods that you've always used, but being willing and able to learn and establish new methodologies for teaching, being innovative, and also keep learning, keep going to maybe continuing education seminars, keep reading things online that establish the latest methods and studies and research in pedagogy can also be extremely important, of course. Then we have the quote-unquote Common Core and career-ready standards, the idea of there being understanding what the world expects children and young adults in terms of their skills and in terms of their knowledge. The Common Core, this is from a site called corestandards.org. The Common Core was a comprehensive establishment of the standards that children are expected to be able to learn. Now, those of you who have kids and have done homework with them, you know that things are taught differently than they were 30, 40 years ago, just because the Common Core has established methodology as being as important as the result. And instead of saying, 6 plus 7 equals 67, they want you to look at it from the tens column and the ones column, and they want you to look at it separately and separate the two things you're doing. And basically, they want you to be able to deconstruct it and reconstruct it. But that's not the key. The key that I want to mention here is that the Common Core really represents what the latest best practices are. It's somewhat controversial. Some people don't like the idea of the Common Core, but the idea is that this is what now is assumed in terms of what you're going to cover. And to understand the Common Core, if you're going to be a teacher, to go through something like this, even if you're not necessarily going to use every idea that they have, and even if you want to teach things that are a little bit different in terms of methodology, that's there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Things have to be individualized, but understanding the Common Core in that, what do the Common Core expect? Resources for the Common Core. They have, for example, myths versus facts over here. Again, I don't know how some of this may be a little biased, again, but the point is, understanding, again, even if you're going to take some of this with a grain of salt, understanding what the Common Core is something that is expected, and it's really incumbent on teachers to at least use this as kind of a minimal level of effectiveness that they should aspire to in the classroom. Next, we are going to start really focusing on methods, patterns of learning, things that can actually help us kind of apply some of the things that we just discussed. First are schema, plural is schemata, which describes a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes information. I have one complicated example of what a schema might look like and one relatively simple one that hopefully should kind of bring that into focus. Let me zoom out a little bit on this. Okay, here's one example. If you hear the word egg, or you want to kind of learn what an egg is, well, we all know what eggs. We've all heard eggs a million times, but in our mind, we have to kind of establish, well, what are we talking about? There's so many different connotations of what eggs are, and we may not consciously think about it, but what we do is we think of eggs in so many different contexts, and depending on that context, we think of different things. We might say, okay, when we think of an egg, are we thinking about breakfast? Well, okay, if we're talking about breakfast, then let's look at the eating components. They're good to eat, fried, boiled, or scrambled. They're nutritious. They have cholesterol, but they have a lot of calcium. We're talking about eggs on our grocery list, then we think of something different. We think of price of eggs, and we think of the farm economy. We think of spoiled eggs that that we may not like, obviously, in terms of its smell and whatnot. We may think eggs in terms of farming. The point is that just one word, one term, one idea, we have to kind of categorize it in so many different elements that we do, even kind of without thinking about it. We break it down to its parts. Okay, what aspect of the egg are we talking about now? Okay, we're talking about food. Okay, well, what aspect of food? Are we talking about preparing breakfast, or are we talking about serving with a steak dinner? Or are we talking about as one of the ingredients in a cake? These are ways in which we kind of, almost subconsciously, we do it so quickly, we organize the categories of information and establish relationships based on what we need in a particular scenario. Here's a much simpler example. Think about this. When you're drawing a bird, Well, a bird is just a whole bird, the one on the right over here. But when we're drawing it or thinking about a bird, there's so many different little components of it. So there's a bird, but the subcomponent of that would be its feathers, its beak, its wings, its talons, whatever it is. The point is that we break it down. Schema is just a way in which we break down things into various elements of them and how they relate to each other. And that brings us to the Piaget idea of accommodation. Accommodation is something that all people do, and it's something that's really a key component of learning. And that is when you have new experience or information causes you to modify your existing schemas. You had a thought process for how something works, you thought something differently, and so therefore you changed your mind. For example, you might have once thought when you were a kid that in the winter it's always cold, and then one day you went outside in February and there was a heat wave and it was 63 degrees, and maybe you changed your outlook when you realized, okay, in winter it's usually cold, or it's cold unless we have some kind of a strange, last winter actually here we had this crazy day where it was like 80 degrees almost in middle of February. And then, of course, the next week it was snowing again. But the point is, the idea is that it's not always cold in February. Okay, it's usually cold in February, depending on where you live, but not necessarily. As we get older, we keep doing this. We keep accommodating our information. We keep, establishing that when I push the brake, the car's going to stop. Well, what if the brakes are broken? Or what if it's wet outside? Or what if there's, some other factor that causes the brakes to not always work? And we kind of realize and adapt, even subconsciously, to the idea that things aren't always necessarily going to work as we expected. That's the idea of accommodation. Of course, the role of accommodation is critical to psychology and educational psychology. Accommodation is part of the adaptation process when you're talking about an individual, when you're talking about somebody learning. It refers to the process of altering one's existing ideas, one's existing schemas, which are, again, categories of ideas and how we categorize things in general, and develop new ideas. A young child may learn dogs and the idea that dogs have 4 legs, and so the child, the 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, might automatically assume that everything with 4 legs is a dog, but then we realize, no, okay, dogs have 4 legs, but there are other things that also have 4 legs. There are cats, there are horses, there are zebras, they all got 4 legs. And of course, this applies through life. It helps us overcome prejudices that we may have developed as children, whether we learned it from other people or just assumed it based on we've seen a few examples of something, and we may assume that everybody in a particular category acts in a certain way, and then we realize that's not necessarily true. That's all part of the accommodation process. Equilibrium and disequilibrium are really part of the accommodation process. Equilibrium is, in biology, this is sometimes referred to as homeostasis when the idea of keeping everything constant. Equilibrium comes from the word equal, where everything is pretty much as you expected or as it always was. That's one of the aspects, and this is a constant cycle, by the way. So you have equilibrium, which means things are what you thought they were and everything is good, and then something disrupts that. You have a disequilibrium. Something challenges or conflicts your, what you've always thought. You always thought it was going to be cold in February, and so you had this equilibrium where every day of February you woke up and you went outside and it was cold and everything was fine. Then one day it was 65 degrees out or 70 degrees out, and you had a little bit of disequilibrium because there was a mismatch between the way you thought about your environment, and you said, this doesn't make any sense. This disrupts my entire equilibrium. And so you have a paradox or a conflict, and then you accommodate. You accommodate that. Well, actually, there's really 2 possibilities. The good thing is the good possibility is you accommodate. You say, okay, well, I kind of have to reconsider my original ideas, and maybe my original ideas weren't 100% accurate. The bad possibility is that you deny the existence of it. You engage in what's sometimes referred to as cognitive dissonance, where you don't believe what you see. You say, oh, well, it can't really be February. Obviously, it's 65 degrees out. It's not really February. It's really March. It's really April, and the calendars are wrong. That's the problem that people have sometimes. People have their scientific facts that they're confronted with, and rather than agreeing and challenging their own preconceptions or misconceptions, they say, well, the scientists are wrong, or or this fact isn't really what it is. Again, I don't want to get controversial. I don't want to start getting into things like global climate change or whatever it is. I don't want to start getting into that, although I kind of just did. But the point is that sometimes people have kind of like that as a defense mechanism. But ideally, the healthiest way to deal with these things when you're talking about accommodation is you have assimilation, which means you assimilated information, you get information that causes your equilibrium, where now everything is fine. Then you got the new situation comes up, which causes a disequilibrium, which is kind of a conflict, and then you accommodate. And then you have your equilibrium again once you've made your accommodation and say, okay, well, now I realize that in February sometimes it is going to be warm, and then you have your new equilibrium until your new equilibrium is disrupted. As we get older, probably we get fewer and fewer disruptions of our equilibrium. When you're a year old or 2 years old, you're probably getting your equilibrium disrupted several times a day. But the thing is, it's still a process that goes throughout an entire lifetime. The next thing I want to focus on is play. Now, play, of course, is a critical component of development. We don't necessarily think of that necessarily as being part of the educational process, but play is just as big as part of the educational process as, let's say, school is, especially when you're talking about very young children. Play can be solitary, which is really what everybody can do, every child can do, which is alone and independent of what other children are doing. But then you have something that also establishes the social framework for a child, and that is cooperative play, working together. That's one of the things that very young schooling does. Let's say, for example, in kindergarten, where perhaps learning things may not be as easy, although obviously these things are introduced in as much as they can be introduced relative to the age level. But cooperative play, of course, is very important in terms of part of the social environment. And there are different types of play that are cooperative. There's parallel play, in which children can basically do different things side by side. They could be in the same classroom, in the same kindergarten room, and they each are building a castle, and they're each building a fortress or whatever it is, but they're not necessarily working together. And then there is associative play. Associative play increases levels of interaction, sharing, trading, turn-taking, interest in what others are doing. Board games and, in general, games are designed around trying to interact with other people when you're talking about children or when you're talking about adults. And certainly, while parallel play is important and relevant for children, associative play is something that is to be encouraged because it helps develop the child's social skills along with creative skills, although even parallel play certainly is something that's important for creative skills as well. That brings us to the point of morality. Well, it's kind of an independent point, but that's where we are now. Heteronormous reality is the idea of morality, Morality, of course, is a sense of right and wrong and a sense of what is considered justice and what is considered fairness. And the idea of heteronomous reality is the idea of morality that is imposed by society's rules. Now, we all, of course, play our sense of morality partially by what has been taught to us by others, whether that be our parents or the law or whatever traditions we respect. That certainly is a big component of what our morality is. Now, children even more so establish that because children don't really have the experience to have developed their own quote-unquote set of opinions in terms of morals. Children's morality is virtually all established by other people. It's virtually all arbitrary. A 4-year-old, 5-year-old child might know that their parents told them that they can't stick a metal fork into an electric socket. They probably don't fully understand why. In fact, it's virtually certain that they don't fully understand why, but they know because their parents tell them not to. And if they do it, they're going to get some sort of consequence that they don't want. Well, that may be simply, it's not that they don't sit there and question and say, well, it's not really morally wrong of me to stick the metal fork into the outlet. They just know that their parents have told them not to, and for whatever reason, whether it's a consequence or whether they want to listen to their parents or some combination thereof, they're willing to accept that. They accept that rules are made by authority figures. I'm sure if those of you who may have kids, even a 4-year-old, 5-year-old can say, well, that's the rules, whether it be a memory game or a checkers game or whatever it is, and they're perfectly content with that's the way it's done, that's the rules, and therefore, if you don't play by the rules, you're cheating. They might not understand the rules. When you get to be older, you decide whether you like the rules, and if you don't like the rules, then you don't play the game, and if you do like the rules, then you do play the game, and if you don't like the rules, maybe you change the game. But a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, even as children get a little older, they're perfectly content to play by the rules that somebody else established, because their morality, their sense of right and wrong, especially in the early component of a person's lifetime, comes from society, comes from other people. Next, let's look at socioeconomic status and how it impacts people, how it impacts children, how it impacts education in general. Now, theoretically, in a perfect world, everybody would have equal opportunity in terms of education. Everybody would have the same access to all the schooling and tutoring that they need. That, as we know, is not really the way it works in real life. Socioeconomic class or socioeconomic status is based on children's or young adults' advantages or disadvantages based on various factors that are related to their family. It doesn't mean somebody from a poor and disadvantaged home can't eventually become a wonderfully educated, highly talented scientist or entrepreneur or whatever, but it does mean that people are at advantages or disadvantages based on their socioeconomic status, which is measured based on income, occupation, education, and prestige in society. Those are kind of 4 factors. If you ask me which one is usually most closely related to socioeconomic status, it's usually based on income. When scientists or psychologists do studies in this area, they'll say, okay, let's measure the educational achievement based on people that are earning under $50,000 and people earning between $50,000 and $75,000 and people earning $75,000 to $100,000. That's usually where you see these studies kind of broken down into. But they'll also look at education. For example, what are the educational indicators for children of parents with graduate degrees, with undergraduate degrees, with some college, with no high school, or some high school, whatever. Those are different things that people study to make a determination of what kind of advantage or disadvantage is a particular child likely to face in terms of the economic factors. Students from low-income neighborhoods lose academically over the summer compared to richer ones because parents who have the resources very often will send their children to camps or summer programs that will help develop them, whereas people in poorer areas may get comparable public educations during the year, but then during the summer they're basically sitting around, not doing very much all day. Here's some places or some areas in which this is a study done by the American Psychological Association, and you look at just this link over here. It's apa.pi. Well, anyway, you can see the link if you're interested in going to it. I'll put it up over here on the board. But there are so many different things that it affects. First it explains what the resources are, but it affects academic achievement, it affects dropout rate, it affects psychological health, career aspirations. You can see this study over here found that socioeconomic barriers hinder people's vocational development, just literally in terms of what they want to do. What are their aspirations? Do they want to be doctors? Do they want to be scientists? Do they want to be lawyers? People who have higher, better socioeconomic backgrounds in terms of education are more likely to have higher aspirations in terms of what their learning are. It's a tremendous advantage or disadvantage that people could have based on this idea of socioeconomic status. Then we move, relatedly, to the concrete operational stage. Again, socioeconomic status affects children and adults throughout their lives. The idea of heteronomous morality is something that, again, affects people, but especially young children. Then you have this age, kind of like the middle stage of a child's development, the ages 7 through 11. Before that, you're probably talking about very little children who don't do a lot of their own thinking. After that, you're talking about people who are practically adults, or at least adolescents. In the middle, age 7 to 11, you're talking about the concrete operational stage, the mechanism by which the child really starts to develop his or her own educational mode, and maybe starts thinking for herself or himself for the first time once in a while. Concrete operational children at this age don't quite think like adults, but they're developing the capacity for logical reasoning. And, you know, a 5-year-old is probably not going to say in a checkers game, well, a 5-year-old's going to say, you know, you're allowed to jump over the piece because that's the rule. Whereas the 9-year-old might say, well, is that really fair to allow that piece to jump that piece in that particular situation? It's the older child, the concrete operational stage child, is more likely to be able to take a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of what the rules are and whether the rules make sense than the child who's 4, 5, 6 might be content to just understand and apply the rules regardless of whether of actually being skeptical about them, whether they make sense. And this idea of inferred reality. Inferred reality is a very interesting example of a mechanism by which a child at this stage can infer things that maybe a younger child wouldn't. The idea over here is you show a child a picture of a red car, and then you put kind of a black sheet on top of it or something that tints it, or like a tinted window or that makes the car look black, whereas the 5-year-old is going to think, well, now the car turned black. The 9-year-old or the 10-year-old might remember or realize that this car is still a red car, it's just being covered. You know, the idea of tinted windows is the same kind of thing. You look through tinted windows, things that get distorted in terms of their color. Children at concrete operational stage might be old enough to understand that the fact that the window's tinted doesn't actually change the color of whatever you're looking at. It just changes your perception of it, which itself is a fairly sophisticated level of thinking. So next, moving on from the concrete operational stage, let's look at the classroom use of reinforcement. Now, the idea of how a child can and does process information is obviously directly related to the classroom, because the classroom is where we try to give the children whatever information and skills that they're going to need. The first thing about classroom use of reinforcement is the idea of making sure that certain behavior is rewarded or punished or discouraged or encouraged to get children to learn things and behave in the way that we think is best for them. So first of all, telling students behavior that they want, and then of course reinforcing one way or the other. For example, when students turn in their homework, the teacher rewards them with computer time or free time or whatever the case may be. That would be an example of positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement would be to take away privilege or assess some other punishment in order to behavior that we don't want to condone. That's a fairly obvious use of reinforcements. Classroom also can be looked at in terms of some mechanisms of teaching, could be looked at direct instruction rather than necessarily just relying on reinforcement. In fact, reinforcement is really a secondary method of education. The most direct method of education, at least in today's day and age, that we use in classrooms is direct instruction. Direct instruction is the kind of instruction that you had when you were children for the most part. Somebody stands up in front of the classroom and tells you stuff, tells you about whatever they're trying to teach you, whether it's science or math or religious studies or whatever the case may be. It would all be based on somebody standing up and telling you what's going on. Direct instruction describes lessons in which you transmit information directly to the students. This happened on this day. This is what we should do. This is what we shouldn't do. And of course, this is most relevant and most effective when you're talking about teaching a well-defined body of information or skills that all students must master. Things, direct instructions may not be as good for things like teaching ethics or morals or creativity. Those things you're probably going to need to establish some sort of role play or some sort of intellectual thinking exercise or practice. But when it comes to teaching dates and times and rules and laws and things like that, then direct instruction is probably the most efficient way to do it. You just get up in front of a room and say, hey, this is that, and this is the capital of the New York, and this is this is what constitutes life processes, whatever the case may be. Direct instruction certainly has its role in that respect. Then other roles might be relevant for other things. So that brings us to the issue of memory. Memory is something that all education relies on. Without memory, education would be totally useless. If you know something, but you're not going to remember it in 20 minutes, then who cares whether you know it right now? And so there are different types of long-term memory that I want to go into very quickly. Episodic memory, semantic memory, and procedural memory. Procedural, as we'll see, is kind of like the culmination of the first two. So let's quickly look at them. First, let's look at episodic memory. Episodic memory means something that you remember. Examples of episodic memory might be remembering where you were on September 11th or some other major event, although some people listening to this might be a little too young to have that kind of memory, but I certainly do. Knowing the name of your siblings, or knowing your own name, or recalling the guests at an event or a party that you were, remembering your first day of school. All of these things are episodic memory, just something that you remember a particular event. Is this necessary for education? Of course it is. If you don't remember things that are specific, that things that happen, then education won't do good. But that's kind of like the basis of memory. That's the most basic type of memory. I remember what happened. I remember I looked outside and it was dark out. I remember I got into an accident and I was afraid, or whatever. The thing is, that's episodic memory, kind of the most basic element of memory. Then we have semantic memory. Semantic memory is recollection gathered from different sources, but not necessarily tied to a particular event. Knowing that the sky is blue. Now, why do we know that the sky is blue? We know it either because we've been taught it or because we've had a bunch of experiences, but it's not based on any particular aspect. We don't know that the sky is blue because on, January 17th, 2017, I went outside and looked up and the sky was blue. Now, that might have happened, but that's not the sum total of the way that we know the sky is blue. We know the sky is blue because we've seen it so many times and because we've been, I guess, that's an easy one, but we know, if we know, for example, that drinking too much alcohol makes us tired or drunk. People might have experienced that, or people might have read about it, or people might have told about it by their parents, or this particular type of behavior is dangerous, or this particular type of behavior is healthful. I know if I go to the gym, I'm going to feel good about myself. Why? Well, A, because I've been told that, B, because I've tried it, not on any one particular occasion, but I've gone to the gym, 72 times, and 63 of them I felt pretty good about myself afterwards. And so that's the idea of semantic memory, knowing how to ride a bicycle. Knowing how to use a phone or a computer, knowing how to use even something as simple as scissors or a pencil would be an example of semantic memory. Generalized information in the form of schemata that we looked at before, just knowing things based on the sum total of some experiences. Then you have something that's even more. Then you have procedural memory. Procedural memory refers to, it's like the next step, knowing how to do something. I know how to fix a bicycle, or even riding a bicycle might even be considered procedural. But knowing how to write something, knowing how to do this recording. How do I know how to do this recording? Because I have procedural memory that I remember other times I've done it, and I remember tutorials that have shown me how to do it, and I know how to operate this software, not because I have any particular episodic memory of having done it in the past, or not because there's just, generalized information. It's just because I've done it so many times, so I have the procedural memory on how to do it. That's kind of like the end game, so to speak, when it comes to memory, and that, of course, is kind of the holy grail when it comes to education. You want to give children and people who are learning something the procedural memory on how to do something, the skills, whether they're going to be accountants or lawyers or doctors. Doctor needs to have the procedural memory of knowing from all the different sources how to diagnose something and what to do about something. Next, let's look at meaningful information. What makes information meaningful from an educational and a behavioral context? There's inert knowledge. Inert knowledge means knowledge that is either ingrained in a person or comes from experience. You don't necessarily need to teach this in a classroom. People know it. Fire is hot and it'll burn your hand. Why do you know that? You know it probably because you've tried it, or probably because you've been burnt, literally and figuratively, at some point, and it's something that doesn't have to be taught in the classroom because it's there. Rote means learning by memorization without necessarily knowing the reason behind it. In the old days, there was much more of a premium on rote learning. Meaningful learning is the learning where you want to establish a deeper meaning behind where the person understands it and understands the reason for it and is more likely to retain it and be able to build on it. Now, rote is more efficient, rote happens faster, but meaningful is really what you want your end game to be. All right, let's look in a little more detail. Inert knowledge is applicable to a wide range of situations because it's something that is very general. Something that inert also means not active. You may have heard that term before. It's something that maybe can't be applied specifically, especially when you're talking about a classroom. Okay, so rote learning is the memorization of facts and association. Here's an example. I'll give you some examples of rote learning. The multiplication tables is an example of rote learning. A phone number. Somebody tell, what's your phone number? My phone number is 425-9941. Now, in my mind, I don't care what the logic behind that is, or if there was any logic. I just want to remember that. Now, if I have my phone with me, I can just whip out my phone and put it in my contacts. But in the old days, I guess you'd have to write it on a piece of paper. And if you had no piece of paper and pen, or if you hear it in a spot where you don't have your phone on you and you can't note it somehow, you just got to commit it to memory. Again, there is no reason for it. It's just the way it is. Other things that you've learned in school also you may have had to establish by rote. The sun is approximately 93 million miles away from the Earth. There's no reason behind it. There's nothing that makes it meaningful. It just is what it is. The vernal equinox is approximately March 21st every year. Again, it's not something that necessarily requires meaningful learning. It just requires rote. Meaningful learning is not arbitrary. It relates to information or concepts that the learners already have, and it allows them to commit it to memory a little bit more. The idea that when you're teaching economics, why does capitalism work, for example? What's the profit motive? And the idea that people behave in certain manners when they're entrepreneurs or running businesses because they need to make money, and that might cause the economy to do better overall. And the idea is it wouldn't make sense to learn that from a rote perspective. Imagine if you're taught in economics class, if people have an incentive, so then they go ahead and make more money. There are so many different factors that are relevant to it, and so many different, what the effects of interest rates are, and what the effects of trade wars and budget deficits and things like that. These are things that if you just learned a million little concepts that when there are trade deficits, people tend to produce less. Whatever. The thing is, you can't just learn them as a series of concepts. You need to understand the logic behind them, and that way you'll be able to kind of internalize and reapply those concepts. So some things are good for rote learning, but ultimately what you want to try to do for everybody that's learning something is to try to graduate that into meaningful learning. And part of establishing a good lesson is the idea of keeping a lesson, any kind of a lesson, on track with clarity. Lesson structures can be, if they're haphazard, and they don't go in any particular order, and they don't have any particular sequence, it's going to be much harder to follow them through. It, of course, depends on different grade levels. Somebody who's 18, 19, 20 is obviously a lot more capable of taking disparate information and understanding where it fits in the grand scheme of things than somebody who is 2, 3, or 4. And the idea of any classroom is, number one, to arouse student interest, establish why it's relevant to the particular student. If the student thinks it's irrelevant, and I can tell you this from my kids, if the kid thinks it's irrelevant, then they're not going to be able to internalize the lesson as well, because they're just not going to be as interested. A kid might know the baseball scores but might not know things in the science class, even though the baseball scores are harder to memorize, because that means something to them. Presenting the new information, of course, that's a critical component. Allowing students to practice the new knowledge and skills. That's something that's sometimes missing in a direct instruction classroom. That, of course, is what homework is based on, and what lessons, what exercises are based on, but it's something that may be missing in a classroom. But some, especially newer philosophical classrooms are based on the idea that you teach the students something and then you give them a chance to apply it, whether it be with a computer model or exercises or learning it over with their friends or whatever the case may be, allowing a student to practice and reinforce. And then, of course, you have another important component, the fourth component, and that's assessment. Assessment is the idea of running tests to make sure the students understand what they're learning, whether it be a test of the student or whether it be a quiz or a project or something. I mean, there are really two types of assessments. There are formative assessments where you learn by the assessment, when you're learning something online or you're learning something in a classroom and you get a little quiz in the middle. So it's not really designed so much to test your knowledge, but it's also designed to kind of help you learn. A pop quiz, a pop 3-question quiz in the middle of class. It's not really going to necessarily, it's not really, your score may not be based on it, your score at the end of the semester may not be based on it, but it may kind of help reinforce it smack dab in the middle. You see that a lot with video lessons, where it'll pause 20 minutes in and give you a couple of questions, and then you answer those questions, and that's kind of a formative assessment. Then you have something called a summative assessment, whereas at the very end you see how much the student has picked up. That's really what the role of a final exam is. And then you have the general concept of keeping the lesson on track with clarity, which establishes from beginning to end, why are we doing this now? What does it connect with what we did before, and how is it going to connect with what we did after? And of course, what you want to try to do is make everything be a logical progression, where the student understands not only what information is being presented, but why that information is being presented in the context of the entire course. Our next section is about conducting learning probes. Probes is a way that learning can be more interactive, rather than just being one-directional, where one person just stands up in front of a classroom and lectures. Certainly lecturing is one way to do it, and the way we're doing it right now is essentially one-directional, because I don't know who's listening to this, and there's no mechanism by which you can ask me questions in the middle of this lecture. Of course, you can email me or whatever it is, but that's one direction. But when you have a classroom, or when you have a tutor, or when you have a situation where you do have some interaction, there are some mechanisms by which to make those interactions as effective as possible. A learning probe could be asking for student reactions. It could be something as simple as that, or it could be assessments, such as posing a question relating to the lesson content. In the middle of a class, you might give the student what's sometimes referred to as a formative assessment, where you give the student a quiz to make sure that they understand what's going on until now. There are many different ways in which to conduct these quote-unquote learning probes. A probe is something that seeks information or something that tests something. Probes can be in many different varieties. It could be a test, it could be a question, it could be a cue of a face. And did the person's face drop? Did the person's face smile? When you're speaking to somebody, you unconsciously take into account these things, and so you conduct probes when you're dealing with people. And the same thing, of course, is applicable when you're talking about teaching a lesson or teaching a class. Let's take a look at a few different techniques when it comes to learning probes. The first thing is the idea of brainstorming. Brainstorming is the idea where students are not only told the information, they are also asked to come up with their own answers. Students are asked to think of all things related to a concept and getting as many ideas out there as possible. Let's take an example. Mr. Brown's class wants to make a holiday coat drive, but can't figure out how to make that happen. Well, okay, then rather than just getting up in front of the classroom and saying, well, the way we could do it is we could tell everybody that they have to bring in coats, or we could stand on the street corner and ask everybody that passes by if they have an extra coat. Or they can sit around in the classroom. Mr. Brown can say, okay, does anybody have any ideas? Maybe we should put up on the school's website that we're having a coat drive. Maybe we should send out emails to all the parents in the class that we're having a coat drive, something to that effect, and the students will then have the opportunity to give their own ideas. And by having the students engage in giving their own ideas, whether they're good ideas or not good ideas, whether they're ultimately used or not ultimately used, the point is you are now getting the students to participate, and you're getting them actively involved in using their brain, and that's one way to improve the interactivity of a lesson. Next, we have the idea of cooperative learning. Cooperative learning is the idea, once again, where you bring interaction to the table, where you're establishing not necessarily one person just telling the other person something, but also the idea of having the student become part of it. Some examples might be active listening, where the 8th grade class is learning about the consequences of the Cold War rather than saying, just telling the students what the consequences were. The students might be asked to give their ideas, and then the teacher can engage in what is sometimes called active listening, where you follow up with either another question or a statement that takes into account what you just heard. For example, let's say the student says one consequence of the Cold War is that there is no more communism. So as a teacher, you might say, well, okay, given that you've made the assumption that there's no communism, how would you describe the Chinese economy today, that they say they're communism? And, you might question the student, you might reinforce the student, but the point is you're taking what the student said into account in your next question. Giving good explanations, of course, avoiding put-downs. That's critical to today's pedagogy, where the idea where you want to, rather than saying you are wrong, say, well, you might have been thinking of this aspect of the lesson, or that has merit in this respect, or you can correct somebody without saying you're wrong. You can correct by somebody saying what you said may apply to some other aspect of the discussion, and of course including other people as well in the discussion is part of the cooperative learning. Continuing with the idea of interactive learning, we will look at Robert Slavens' Kate model, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but this was published, I think, in the late 1990s by Robert Slavens. And what he said essentially is that you need these elements in order to have effective, or the most effective possible, classroom learning. At quality of instruction, appropriate levels of instruction, incentives to the listener to learn. We sometimes think education is its own reward. That's not necessarily true. People in general in the world, whether it be children or adults, anybody learning things, respond to incentives and, of course, time. Quality of instruction makes sense to the students, simply is based on the idea the students can understand what you're talking about, rather than it just being something that's over their heads, or something that has bullet points that doesn't explain things. Something needs to be quality. It's quality if the listener, if the reader, can understand what is being discussed. Appropriate levels of instruction, of course, means the fairly self-explanatory idea that it shouldn't be too difficult or too easy, based on the intended audience. There should be incentives, which means the student should be motivated to learn the material, and of course the appropriate amount of time should be set forth, or should be engaged. Students should have enough time, but maybe also not too much time. We've all been in classes where we've spent days and days on things that could have been covered in 1 or 2 days, and eventually you get bored, and you get disinterested, and you get disengaged, and you get turned off eventually. So there's allocated time where the teacher allocates and uses, in other words, where the teacher lectures or the teacher gives out instructional materials, and then there's engaged time where you're having the student do something, whether it be homework or collaborative work together, projects, things like that. Obviously, time is also an important element, in terms of the first 3 being the things that you think of more so than time, but time is also important because students won't be able to master the lesson content unless they are able to practice the task. That's one of the important things of homework, where no matter how good a teacher you are, if the students don't reinforce it by doing homework, then they're not going to be able to fully understand what's being discussed. That includes, of course, cooperative learning skills. Again, these are all things that we already discussed. Active listening, good explanations, including other people, avoiding put-downs. Again, we all discussed. Reinforcers is something that goes to the incentives that we discussed before. One of the points in the Quate model was the incentive, to make sure that you give people incentive to learn, and reinforcers is part of that dynamic. A reinforcer is a consequence that strengthens a behavior. Of course, reinforcers could be positive, or reinforcers could be negative. You lose a certain number of points if you don't do your homework. That's a negative reinforcer. You get praise, or you get some sort of reward if you do well. That is a positive reinforcer. It could be something tangible like money or food or whatever, or it could be something intangible like praise. Rewarding somebody with praise is something that is a positive reinforcer. None of them work 100% of the time. I mean, here's just one example of what we've all probably seen, where no matter how much you praise someone, they might not necessarily respond to that, and that's fine, because not all incentives work for all people. Some people are willing to work harder for praise. Some people don't care that much for praise. Some people are willing to work harder for money. Some people maybe have a little bit more resistance to that. The point is, reinforcers are certainly different for different people. And that's why the effectiveness of a particular reinforcer has to be demonstrated. It has to be demonstrated through experimentation. Until you've actually seen it, you can't necessarily assume that a particular reinforcer is going to be effective. And sometimes the only way to know for sure is to test it. You can try a particular incentive on 10 people and it'll work, and on the 11th person it doesn't, because different people just react differently. You can test things on the general public and get trends. You can say that this kind of incentive works well on 75% of the people, or on 90% of the people, or on 10% of the people, but certainly you have to look at things on an individual basis if you really want the best reinforcer for every individual. I wanted to add this little PowerPoint that I'm going to give you access to as well, regarding a little bit more explanation of Slavens' Quate model of effective practice. So here are some of a little bit more explanation of the four factors. There's the quality of instruction, which is the degree to which information are presented to students so that they could learn them. And the direct instruction, of course, is something that incorporates all of the elements of quality instruction. That's the idea that there are other methods of instruction, of course, but at least in the classroom, you really need direct instruction. You can't rely completely on things that are indirect, like practical learning and whatnot. The appropriate level of instruction, which is the idea that the teacher makes sure that the student have the skills but haven't already learned it. If it's just a review, I mean, it's one thing to review, which is fine, but to go just to have the entire lesson be a review of the previous lesson is kind of pointless, and it's going to get people turned off perhaps. But if you're, for example, teaching something, algebra, the student has to know arithmetic. If you're teaching calculus, the student has to know algebra. These are things that are, pretty basic. Appropriate levels of instruction means the idea of the ability to understand the instruction is really the level. The level has to be the point at which the students have the ability to understand what you're talking about. And the incentive, of course, is the degree to which the teacher makes sure that the student is motivated by whatever external means may be necessary. And time, of course, is the degree to which students are being given enough time to learn the material. Again, fairly self-explanatory. I did want to show you this flowchart, which I thought was interesting. Leadership and school climate. Leadership is the teacher, the person that's in charge of the learning, and the role of making sure that the student has the environment that is necessary. That interacts with the overall climate. Now, those two things combine with one another. Is there emphasis in the school on this subject? If there is none, then leadership is going to suffer, no matter how good a teacher you are. If the students don't respect the subject matter that you're covering, it's going to be much more difficult. Is there an orderly environment? Is there an expectation for success? These are things that certainly have effects on the ability of the teacher to work. The teacher, the leader in other words, also has the responsibility to supervise the students, to make sure the students are on the appropriate levels. Entrance testing, diagnosis, meaning making sure the students have the sufficient basis upon which to learn the materials, meaning integration, and these are all things that the teacher controls. And then the supervision and the school climate also go into teacher behavior, which means the teachers doing the adequate preparation, doing the appropriate instruction, doing the appropriate planning. And these things, of course, influence the student behavior, which means the students' investment and the ability of the students to work hard enough to have the success that they need, which in the end, all of these factors contribute to the ultimate goal, which of course is the student achievement. That segues into our discussion of learning and behavior. Obviously, self-regulated learning is the idea of how a student contributes to the learning environment, or lack thereof, so to speak. And students can be taught to monitor and regulate their own behavior. These are through strategies of getting the student to be cognizant of what is important to promote a positive learning environment and the ability to understand the information. Here we have Meichenbaum's model of self-regulatory learning, in which students should be trained to say to themselves, what is the problem? In other words, what do I need to do, and what are the impediments to accomplishing whatever academic goal I have over here? What's the plan? Am I using the plan? And then, of course, to self-assess and make a determination of whether the student is actually succeeding. And this allows students to assess and acknowledge their progress at a given task. That's the kind of the overview of it. Let's take a look at it in terms of more specific. The problems can be specified in terms of inability, lack of motivation, and just unwillingness to do what it takes. Those are the problems to be overcome, and then for each of those aspects of the problem, a student can create or can be advised to create a plan to deal with those aspects of the problem. Related to that is, of course, the issue of routine misbehavior, which is obviously any kind of behavior that is counterproductive to the student achieving his or her academic goals. Now, misbehavior can't all necessarily automatically be prevented, but there are some aspects of what teachers can do to at least prevent or at least minimize the possibility of misbehavior, presenting interesting lessons, captivating people's attention, efficient use of time rather than wasting time on going over the same thing 12 times or asking inane questions, and of course structuring instructional activities so that people are engaged. And that brings us to the idea of how misbehavior is maintained. Now, maintain means anything could happen once. Somebody could be tired, somebody could be having a bad day, or whatever it is. But if there are the same misbehaviors that are cropping up over and over, there must be some sort of reinforcer. And the idea of making sure that you don't have that reinforcer or negating that reinforcer is a big component of trying to make sure that classroom behavior is maintained. For example, peer pressure. This is an example. Tanya always mocks the principal when he comes in to speak to the teacher. This is a reinforcer, and the reinforcer is that she enjoys making the class laugh. She enjoys the attention. Whatever the reinforcer may be, attention, alleviating boredom, wasting time, filibustering him, frustration, boredom, fatigue. Something is probably reinforcing that behavior, and by understanding what is reinforcing that behavior, that makes it much more possible or much more manageable to be able to deal with it and to be able to control it and to be able to end it or at least minimize it. Related to the issue of problems and challenges in the classroom is the integration of students with disabilities. Now, disabilities could be something as severe as deafness or blindness. It could be immobility, or it could simply be learning challenges and people that have learning disabilities or less severe learning challenges. It really runs the gamut and doesn't mean any one particular thing. And these students that have challenges for whatever reason, obviously have to be integrated socially as well as instructionally. Now, obviously, there are certain schools and certain classrooms that cater specifically to people with certain types of disabilities, but that's not always possible or desirable to separate them out away from their peers and away from the general public. Things like peer tutoring can help students with learning disabilities to give them the extra one-on-one attention that they might need. The role of the teacher is, of course, critical. The attitude towards these students is important for teacher-student interactions and to set the example for the rest of the students. Should the rest of the students look at the people as, well, they're really not in our social sphere and really we don't have to worry about them? Or if those people are integrated by the teacher, it's much more likely that the students will treat them as one of their own and be able to try to help them along. There are federal programs under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires comprehensive accommodations for people with disabilities. That's talking about things, for example, providing audios to people who are deaf, providing maybe Braille resources to people who are blind, audio to people who are blind. For deaf, maybe to provide extra explanatory written materials, ramps for people who have ambulatory problems. These are required. Reasonable accommodations are required of schools, especially schools that are accepting federal funds, even if it costs the school more than the student is paying tuition. The student might be paying $10,000 in tuition, and the school might spend $30,000 or $40,000 to accommodate that student. The theory is the student's able to do it because it's able to basically take tuition from everybody else, and the community is in essence indirectly paying for the accommodations of the disabled people. And based on the Americans with Disabilities Act, this is considered something that's worth it for society. Internship programs are sometimes established. For example, I have over here this headline from Dispatch, where internship program teaches job skills to people with disabilities, where people with disabilities are given special kinds of jobs and special kinds of accommodations just so that they should have the most possible normal experience. You know, the idea of special education teachers. Some of you may be considering going into special education. I found this article here that says that there's a shortage of special education teachers. And special education teachers doesn't mean anything different than people who are trained educators who are able to deal with people's uniqueness and able to deal with people's disabilities. They're trained to be able to deal with students who may have attention deficit disorder, who may have learning disabilities, who may have physical limitations, who may be, may have hearing or seeing limitations as well. Here's an example of a little chart where, as back in 2006, there were enough teachers to cover the students with disabilities. The trend as of 2016 is actually going the other way, where the ratio of students with disabilities to teachers is growing, meaning that more teachers who can teach students with disabilities are certainly being it's important to develop more of those skilled teachers. In the last decade, again ending in 2016, so it's not so current, but still, special education teachers dropped 17%, while special education students dropped only 1%. That means there was an effective 16% increase in special education students with respect to special education teachers. Again, bringing into sharper focus the acuity of the shortage that there is in special education teachers. Next, we're going to look into validity of assessment, validity of testing, and what kind of testing there are. To start with, I want to look at the two basic types of assessment, or the two basic types of evaluation. Those two terms are sometimes used interchangeably, and those are formative and summative. Formative are designed to tell teachers whether instruction is needed. Formative is the sort of thing where you're testing somebody, but not necessarily to find out what their achievement are, but to see how they're processing along. It's as much to inform the teacher as what I have to teach as it is to the student in terms of what the student has learned. As every teacher knows, sometimes in the class you say, okay, 17 times 3 is what? And you wait for an answer. Now, you're not necessarily worried about which particular student knows that 17 times 3 is 51. You're not necessarily looking at which students are paying attention, although you might be. But you're trying to get a feel, okay, have you been effective? What do the students know? Can I move on to the next thing? If I'm dealing with algebra and people don't know multiplication, it's going to be very difficult for me. I may have to go over certain things. I may ask a simple question and look around and see how enthusiastic people are, how well people know the answers to this, and I'll use that kind of a cue as to how quickly I can move along with this course. If a bunch of the students answer and they're quick, I may make a little mental note, okay, this class is on the ball. This class I can teach relatively quickly, whereas if people are slow and people are disinterested and people are disengaged, I may have to take steps to try to engage the class before I can even think about going through the harder material. Here's an example of a formative assessment cycle. Examining the pupil work, and again, work doesn't have to be written work doesn't have to be a report or a test or anything like that. It could be a quiz, could be a simple multiple choice quiz, it could be just an answer, it could be just a facial expression, it could be virtually any cue I'm getting from the pupil, and that informs the teacher knowledge. In other words, okay, okay, now I know what level, or at least I have a better guess as to what level this class is ready for. That then informs and sets the instruction and teaching methods. What am I going to do? Am I going to have them do more work before we start? Am I going to go straight to the hardest material? Am I going to first schedule an easy test before we even get into the more complex components? Then the teacher sets the tasks, homework, tests, whatever work, and then the pupils do the work, and the cycle starts all over again. Okay, now the teacher can see what the pupils' work was. Again, it could be an in-class quiz, could be just a question thrown out to the class, could be pretty much anything. And now the teacher says, okay, well, now the students are at this level. Maybe they've raised a little bit of a level since we spent an hour talking about arithmetic, or since we spent 2 days talking about the Revolutionary War, and now we're ready to go on to the early components of American history. That is the formative assessment, or formative evaluation. Then I want to move quickly on to the summative assessment. Summative assessment is the idea of, okay, what is the sum total, or the sum result of what the students have understood based on this. That's really the final exam, the final project or example of summative assessment. And what you're trying to figure out is, okay, are there common gaps in student learning? You know, if I give a test that's 50 questions long and I see 60% of them got number 38 wrong, well, maybe that's an indication that number 38 either was an unfair question, or that the underlying substantive material that covered question 38, we really need to go over that in class again. What information is retained, what information has been mastered. Is there a need to develop further teaching methods and enrichment activities, and what are the strengths and weaknesses in the teaching plan as a whole? This is the classic closing the assessment loop that so many educators talk about. The idea is, okay, what have the students done, what have the students achieved, and what can we take from that to see which part of the curriculum have to be strengthened and which parts of the curriculum can be left as they are. Here's an example of a Venn diagram between formative and summative assessments. They're both assessments. They're both mechanisms by which a teacher can learn what the effectiveness of the lectures are, but you can see both formative and summative assessments are ways to assess the pupils and evaluate the pupils, are used for student feedback, not necessarily either student feedback in their own terms or student feedback based on the results of their exams, which talk louder than anything, and assist in future lesson planning. Formative assessments are part of the instructional process. They include things like quiz, voting. There are lots of little apps that do that in a classroom where you can have people hold the little machines where they vote for something the teacher asks. I do that when I teach online. We do quizzes, and we have like kind of multiple choice, and the students vote for what they think the correct answer is, and that helps me see as the lessons go along how well the students are doing in this particular subject. Or should I go? Sometimes the students will do badly on a question, and I'll spend the next 2-3 minutes going it back over and trying to reteach it because I see it just didn't work the first time. Homework or classwork, exit surveys, these are all things that they're low stakes. The students may get graded on it, but it's usually not the form of it's not the main component of their final grades. But it gives them the opportunity to kind of influence how the effective the teacher has been. Then, of course, the summative is what the students know at a particular point. End-of-year assessments, final exams, courseworks, SATs, entrance exams, things like that. Bar exam if you're a lawyer, the CPA exam if you're going to be an accountant. These are all very, very summative assessments. At the end, you're trying to figure out, what does this person know? Where can we place this person? What can this person do for a living? A Cooper-Smith final exam, of course, would be a very, very much a summative assessment, where we're trying to look at, in terms of a snapshot in time, what do you know, and therefore have you achieved something that's worth these 3 college credits. So that brings us to problem solving. Now, problem solving is obviously a key component of any educational endeavor, because really what you want to teach people ideally is not just how to, what a particular general did on one particular date, or what the particular capital of one country is, but how to solve problems on their own. That's really the key component of what school ought to be. So, and when you come to problem-solving evaluation elements, you have to use some tools, and that is organizing the problem, the procedures to solve the problem, whether it be something that is automatic or something that's always the same, like solving an algebra or calculus problem, or something that requires creativity and changes from day to day, like in a social structure. A solution, and of course the logic that goes into that so that the project or the problem can be solvable on a repeatable basis. Let's look at these one at a time. First of all, we're going to talk about problem organization. You can make charts, you can make graphs, you can make representations. The law school admissions test has a section on, I think they call it analytical reasoning, sometimes they call it games, and they'll ask questions like, here's an example. It's kind of like riddle almost. The university library budget committee has reduced exactly 5 of 8 areas of expenditure, and it gives it such easy to remember names as G, L, M, N, P, R, S, and W. And then it says in both, it gives you some rules. G and S are reduced, W is reduced. If N is reduced, then neither R nor S is reduced. It gives you a series of rules, and then it asks you things like, which of the following pair is something which neither of which can be reduced? Well, anyway, you can read the question. But the thing is, they're riddles, and what they require is the representation, require really writing a whole bunch of rules. And this is an example. Again, this is just an example that they give you, but they kind of give you an idea of what you can write as rules, and therefore that will establish the ability to answer the question. You see that very often when you're talking about riddles. I'm sure you've all heard riddles. Well, if there's a fox and a goat and a cow that have to get across a river, and there's a farmer and a boat, and the rule is the fox can't go with the goat, and you have a whole bunch of different rules, and you have to figure out how to get them all across the river based on a whole predetermined set of rules. In order to be able to answer the question, you got to organize it. Now, you may be able to organize it in your head if the problem is relatively simple. You may have to organize it on paper if the problem is not simple. But either way, the first thing you have to do is organize it. If you can establish a table or chart, you might even use an Excel spreadsheet if it's very complicated, if there's a whole bunch of them. But understanding the problem is the first key element. Then you have to establish a procedure for answering it, and that procedure carry to a solution and make any mathematical computations that are necessary. You have the information, now you have to figure out, okay, what is the procedure to get the answer? What is the procedure to multiply this, or to divide that, or to add this, or to enter that formula? Especially when you're talking about things like finance questions, when you're talking about how much money you need to save every year for the next 20 years to be able to become a millionaire when you retire. Well, you got to assume a certain interest rate, and you got to assume a certain savings rate, and then you can use formulas, which is your procedure, to figure out what the answer is. And then, of course, you have to find the solution, and once you find the solution and you've established the logic behind the solution and everything makes sense, what you've done now is you've made something that is repeatable. You've made something that can be reused. That's the key to any scientific method. The whole idea of the scientific method and experimentation and the ability to do things that will get you good results is it repeatable? If it's not repeatable, it's not really a very good experiment, because then nobody else who's looking to confirm it could possibly confirm it. They just have to take your word for it. The hallmark of a good experiment is that it is repeatable. Okay, then I want to turn to, again, the related issue of reliability, or validity. Validity and reliability are important elements in determining what you can do with exam results. The whole class got a 95 average on the test. Does that mean the whole class is doing great, or does that mean the test was extremely easy? Or, for example, did the whole class cheat on the test, in which case your results really tell you nothing? Where is there evidence of reliability in a particular test? That's one of the key aspects of assessment that people who are looking for accreditation or looking for recognition, that's one of the things they have to answer. Not only, okay, here's your test, how do you know your test is reliable? How do you know that if somebody who passes your test in educational psychology really knows enough about educational psychology to be considered worthy of getting 3 college credits for it? So what you're always looking for is evidence of validity and reliability. Concurrent evidence of validity is how well a particular test correlates with previously measures that themselves have been validated. If New York State gives a Regents exam every year for the last 30 years in geometry, and the results have been a certain point, the students have averaged 78, and the median has been an 81, and 82% of people have passed it, whatever their results have been based on a particular scenario, and assuming things haven't changed very much from year to year. Well, okay, the next year's Regents exams, if they change a little bit, what happens to the results? Do the results vary wildly? If they don't vary wildly, if they're consistent, well, then you can see, I guess, they're at least comparable in validity to what you saw before. One common way of looking at concurrent validity is measuring a new test against the one that has already been tried, tested, and validated. If you have a standardized test that produced results, and you reproduce it based on similar circumstances, you would accept at least somewhat similar results to occur. Same thing, of course, can apply to a quiz, which is lower stakes and usually a formative assessment, but still, you still want to make sure that it's valid, and that can be an informative feedback device. But you have to realize you're not going to be looking for quite the same level of consistency. A 3-question quiz or a 5-question quiz can just vary tremendously. A New York State Regents exam, people have been studying, thousands and thousands of people have been studying for weeks and weeks, and they know what the stakes are. They're going to give their best efforts. Now, you never know. Some people might have headaches. Some people might, have not paid attention, whatever. But overall, you're talking about 2,000 people taking it. You figure overall the results are going to be pretty comparable. Quizzes are very different. Quizzes are low stakes. Students know that. So they may not put in their A efforts. There could have been a big ball game the night before. People could have stayed up. People might not have studied. So you have to realize that just because a quiz has a wider variety, or really a wider disparity of results, doesn't inherently make it less reliable or less valid. But still, you can at least, within those allowances, establish some reliability. If everybody in the class gets 100 on the quiz, you might be able to make a determination that this quiz may be too easy, or I'm doing a really, really, really good job of teaching the material. If everybody gets a 0, then you can make an inference that this is not a fair test, or that I'm doing a really lousy job teaching the material. And then, okay, and it would also, of course, you want to increase the sample size to the extent possible. If you have 2 questions on the quiz and you're going to judge somebody and they got a 50, well, they only got, they only got one, they got one wrong and one right. It's just not a very big sample size. That doesn't mean it's not worth it as a formative assessment. If you give the entire class two questions on a quiz, and you see on one question 89% of them got it right, and on the other question 50% of them got it right, you might be able to conclude that I need to focus the future lesson, or the rest of the lesson, more on the material covering the second question than the first question. So it's not bad as a formative assessment, but it's not very reliable. It's such a small sample size that to say, well, the students only know 50% of the material that's being covered, that's not a warranted conclusion at all. That's why when you're giving a test, it's really not considered appropriate to give a very, very short test. For example, we could give you a test, we can teach you all this material, or have you learn all this material, and then say, here's your test, and it consists of 10 multiple choice questions. Now, theoretically, if they're drawn randomly from the same question pool, then it's could be just as valid, because they're drawn from the same random pool, and scientifically speaking, it might be it might be just as likely that you'll get the same grade on a 10-question test than on a 40-question test or on a 50-question test. But still, the sample size is so small that there's just a higher risk that people are going to do badly because of bad luck, or do well because of good luck. That's why, of course, we try to give question tests that are a little bit longer than that. So therefore, of course, all of these ideas kind of relate to the idea that educational practice is impacted greatly by research. Researching, looking at what methods have worked, what quizzes have given good results, what types of quiz questions have been conducive to student learning and formative assessments, what types of summative assessments have been good indicators. I mean, just to give you some examples, I've worked myself on a lot of these educational research projects, so I can tell you that research has shown that negative multiple choice questions aren't as valid as positive multiple choice questions. Questions like, which of the following is not true? You've probably all gotten a million of those types of multiple choice questions, and they're a little frustrating, and in fact, research has shown that those are not as valid mechanism of asking questions than asking which of the following is true. I remember in law school, in the admissions test, I think we had questions like, which of the following is the worst argument? Which is a little bit of a value judgment, but those questions I don't think are as good. Things like also multiple choice questions in general have been found to be very good indicators of knowledge. Perhaps even more so than having students write essays, which are very subjectively graded. Multiple choice is very objective. How well do you know something? But writing multiple choice questions themselves is difficult. Do you write it in a way that requires students to make inferences? Do you write it in a way that only requires students to repeat back facts? Well, higher level multiple choice questions that are considered valid on the college level, are questions that ask students to make inferences and frame things in terms of hypotheticals, and ask students to apply their knowledge, analyze things, evaluate things, synthesize information, rather than just understand, comprehend, or repeat information that they've been established. And research, of course, also has impacts on educational policies, professional development, teaching materials. All of these things can be geared towards assessments that are considered valuable. Okay, let's take a look at Piaget's assimilation. Assimilation, first of all, of course, is the cognitive process that manages how we take in new information or incorporate that new information. Assimilation is, the word assimilate means to bring together or to come together. The idea when a child learns the word dog, he eventually begins to identify other similar-looking canines as dogs. The 2-year-old might know that this is the family dog, but may not understand that the animal walking outside on 4 legs is also a dog, but eventually the assimilation process allows the child to learn that. Just to give you a little bit of background, this is Piaget's cognitive theory, which is a little bit different than the assimilation rule, but it's all based on one kind of comprehensive way of looking at things. And these were covered, by the way, in other courses. If you've taken other psychology courses with us, there's schemas which are building blocks of knowledge. In other words, schemas are cohesive, repeatable action sequence possessing component actions that are tightly interconnected and governed by a core meaning, like the mechanics of how something works, how a recipe can put together for chocolate cake or a bowl of cereal or hot water or whatever it is. It would be example of a schema because it's a repeatable action sequence that are tightly connected, governing a core meaning. I am baking a cake. How do I bake a cake? Well, I take the flour and I take the water and I take the sugar and I take the juice and I mix it up and I bake it for 350, etc. Adaptation process, which is equilibrium, making sure that you are able to do all elements in order to achieve equilibrium. If it's hot outside and you go outside and make yourself cool, that's maintaining equilibrium on a very, very basic level. Assimilation, which we already discussed, and accommodation is adjusting your behavior, adjusting whatever it is you can control to conform to your needs. And then the stages of cognitive development, which is in children really sensory motor, which is really just using physical mechanisms, things like your arms, your head, crawling, walking. Pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Formal operational being the top level where you're able to operate to do everything that a human being would normally understand. Concrete operational is when you start as a child to be able to do things to accomplish tasks. Pre-operational is when you're still preparing for that level. Next, I want to quickly focus on Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning. This is the idea of when people, and children specifically, get to the point of how they look at things from a moral perspective, from a right and wrong perspective. And Kohlberg studies children's responses to a series of structured moral dilemmas, and Kohlberg really divided them into 3 stages: pre-conventional, conventional and post-conventional. Well, let's take a look at what those mean. And for this is a simple one. We'll look at something a little bit more complex later. Pre-conventional is when you don't even really understand the conventions yet. Conventions means the rules of society. The rules of how people generally expect people to operate in the adult world. Pre-conventional, 3 to 7 years old, the only thing the child can really fully focus on is, number one, avoiding punishment, whatever form that may take in the particular household or school or whatever it is, and obtaining rewards. Basically, you can focus on what you think is going to work for yourself. It's very hard to fully grasp at that age what society expects from a moral level. I mean, you can be told what's moral. You can be told that it's immoral to hit somebody, but it's hard to really internalize that at that point. At 8 to 13, or the conventional stage, a child, or growing adult in this case, can use that, I guess, a conventional stage, which is the idea of obeying rules and regulations and belonging and being accepted, or obviously not doing those things, based on what society expects. You can more understand. Okay, these are the societal rules. I can't drive more than 55 miles an hour. For the 4-year-old can understand I can't drive more than 55 miles per hour because I'm going to get pulled over and get a ticket, or because it's dangerous I might get into a crash. The 9-year-old might be able to understand, okay, well, this is what we as a society have agreed with each other to impose these restrictions on us because we want things for the better, for the public safety. That's the conventional stage. And there's post-conventional, where we can allow our sense of morality to guide our lives. We can make and keep promises, and we can develop our own moral compass and our own moral ideas, and determine how we live our lives based on that. That's the highest level. Here is in a little bit more detail. This is, of course, the pre-conventional stage, the purple, obediency and punishment as a response to lack of obediency can be established. There's no real difference between for an infant. There's no difference for an 18-month-old, 21-month-old who shoves the fork in the socket and the parent yells at him. The child doesn't understand that it's morally right or morally wrong to shove the fork in the socket. The child only understands that if I shove the fork in the socket, the mother's going to yell at me, and that's the only real way that they can understand. They're not capable of understanding really reward and consequences beyond that. Then you have self-interest, which a child can gain certainly for the next few years. And interest shifts to rewards rather than punishment. You can secure the greatest benefit for yourself if you know the place in class, or if you get a test, you're going to get a prize when you get home. And if you don't, you're going to get in trouble when you get home. Self-interest. Then you have that middle level, that conventional stage. School-age children can understand the good boy, good girl effort. Effort is made to secure approval. You want your parents to be proud of you, and you want to be able to conform to rules. And then finally, when you have teens and adulthood, you have this idea of the social contract, the social strata. If I behave properly and I do things that people will appreciate, I will gain more of an acceptance in my society. I'll gain a higher social level. It's something you see a lot in high schools. One of the big problems sometimes in high schools is that everything is based on social level and everything is based on social status, and people trying to do what they can to gain a higher social status, even if it doesn't have the kind of concrete reward that can be defined so easily. And finally, you have universal principles, where people, when they're adults, they might think about these things, they might not think about these things, but certainly adults are perfectly capable of saying, my philosophy is, my morality is, I think people ought to do that, I think people ought to do that, whether it's religious or philosophical or society-based, or people can think of and make up pretty much whatever they like, and they can make up their own ideas. The ideas might make sense, the ideas might not make sense, but they certainly can be based on universal principles. And this is also a different representation of the same idea, starting with avoiding punishment as a little kid, self-interest, the good boy attitude. And then when the child gets to be 11, 12, 13, the child can start to understand the idea of law and order morality, where society needs to establish these rules in order to protect people, or in order to enforce whatever it thinks it needs to enforce. Then you have the social contract. Social contract is definitely an adult idea, but it's something that an older child is able to, to comprehend. The idea that we're giving up some of our freedoms in order to allow law and order. And then finally, the principle of the matter, where people can determine their own levels of what they think is right and what they think is wrong. Okay, that's the conventional stage. Just an example of the conventional stage is the idea. This would be the idea of the law and order morality. Taking more than a few grapes in a supermarket may be considered acceptable because everyone does it. This is the idea that something may necessarily violate the rules, but may not necessarily be considered it may not necessarily be considered violative of norms. I'll just give you another example. You can explain to a 6-year-old that the sign on the street that says 30 means that you're only allowed to go 30 miles an hour. And certainly a child can understand that, because if not, I'm going to get pulled over and the policeman's going to give me a ticket. And or otherwise it's dangerous. There could be an accident. And now try telling that same 6-year-old, well, if you're going 35, it's okay too, because even though it's over 30, everybody does it. It's going to be hard for the 6-year-old to grasp. Whereas the older child, once you get to this point, this idea of the social contract, it's the idea, well, yes, it's technically illegal, but the assumption is that people do it and therefore it's okay. That's some of the ideas of getting to these stages where you're able to impose morality, but things become more gray, less black and white, more subject to individual interpretation. Things start, and then the child can't understand anything. Then they are able to understand things really in black and white, and then later on things start to get a little bit grayer. And that thing happens through adulthood also. There's a famous idea that 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds tend to see things more in black and white than 50 or 60-year-olds, because the 50 and 60-year-olds may have had more experience in understanding that things aren't as easy to define specifically in black and white. Now let's take a look at behavioral learning, and some of this will be a review for some of the concepts that we've discussing, but the idea of using behavior to influence the learning process. Some principles of behavioral learning include reinforcers, which can be primary or secondary. It could be the main thing that the person is looking for, or it could be secondary. Trying to get a 90 on an exam is one thing, and saying if you get a 90 on the exam, you get to go for a trip this weekend. It's a secondary enforcer, but certainly it's still a reinforcer. The primary enforcer would be you want a particular grade because you want a higher average, and you think that proves that you know the material. Either way, reinforcers are key elements because people react to incentives, and people are going to react to incentives regardless throughout human history. The idea of incentives has driven everything. It's driven economic indicators, certainly. The idea of capitalism is based on the idea that people work hard because they want money, and the money is then going to be able to buy them what they need. Punishment, of course, is a negative reinforcer, weakening behavior either by introducing adverse consequences or removing reinforcers. You're not going to be able to get recess. You're going to have to do extra homework. You're going to have to go to summer school. That obviously is also a negative reinforcer. Information processing models is the idea that students remember things that they process. Students process information when they manipulate it. They look at it from different perspectives. They analyze it. If you're teaching whether something is right or wrong, for example, it's a lot more helpful if students understand the idea, why it's right, why it's wrong. They'll learn it a lot better. Now, some things it's fairly obvious. It's pretty obvious why murder is wrong. We don't have to sit here and discuss why murder is wrong. It's something that violates social convention. Fine. But let's say, for example, you're teaching why insider trading is wrong. It's wrong to trade on information that you have that you received from somebody in the company. It's selling the stock because of that. Well, why is that wrong? It may help to teach students the rules if they have a discussion as to what the problem is. Should it be part of the free market? Why does it hurt the free market? Why does it hurt the market overall? Why does it hurt public confidence? They've got to manipulate it. And going through, that's sometimes referred to as the Socratic method, and when it comes to a law context, where you discuss and ask questions and answer questions about where your opinions and conclusions logically lead to. And this model of looking at things and breaking down things is something that helps people understand more so than just regurgitating facts. And that includes the idea of using visual and verbal coding to learn bits of information. Teacher wants student to know what a giraffe is, so take them to the zoo and see this is a giraffe and this is how it looks. May not be the easiest thing in the world, but maybe the next best thing is a picture or a computer program or a computer model. People learn by seeing and they learn by doing. Hands-on science exhibits are a feature and a staple of many of the better science magazines, science museums that there are. Whether it be the Liberty Science Center or the Philadelphia Franklin Institute, or one common feature they have is that you don't just want to tell the students, okay, well, an earthquake's going to destroy the building. You may put an earthquake on the put like a blocks building on the platform and push the button, and that simulates a 7.5 on the Richter scale, and you see what happens to the blocks. They fall. That's one way in which information is processed. Review prerequisites is the idea that the teacher, the instructional designer, needs to be able to ensure that the students have mastered prerequisite skills. Algebra for calculus, arithmetic for algebra, some algebra for geometry, some basic English skills for complex literature or writing courses, things like that. You need to be able to go over skills that students need in order to understand the lesson. You can assume that they know it, or you can spend the first few minutes of a lecture doing the prerequisite materials, or give them in the syllabus, say, if you don't know this material, you have to learn this material, and here's how to do it. Go watch this video, go read this book, etc. And then you can link information that's already in their minds to the information you're about to present, usually, again, by going over some of the basics, even if the students already know it, but by getting them in the frame of mind, or jogging their memory, or reminding them this is what you're going to know for this next aspect of what we're teaching. Next, I want to look at the constructivist approach. Now, the constructivist approach is the idea, and I'm going to give you another little slide over here, is the idea that development of understanding requires the learner to actively engage in meaning making. Meaning making is a general term, but it means in the idea of defining the learning activities, constructing the learning activities in a way that will be best overall for the learner to be able to internalize them. The idea of constructivism can be summarized in this kind of idealized sentiment of the 21st century classroom being filled with dynamic assortment of learners, students coming from all sorts of socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural diversification, challenging the idea of just the normal teacher-to-student lecture statement regurgitation type of model that we've had in the past. And the idea of constructivism is really all about engaging the student and establishing cooperative learning. That's really the fundamental idea of constructivism. And it's based on the idea that each of us has our own rules, and each of us has our own ways in which we learn, and the most effective models. And kind of the idea of constructivism is to combine the pedagogical insights, even of other students. You know, students may not necessarily know the material as well as the teacher does, but they can help design and they can help put into effect an environment in which it's most effective for the most number of students. So back to our slides. Constructivism would look at trying to make sure that students are put in part of the teacher role. Constructivism is based on the idea of reciprocal teaching. The teacher works with small numbers of learners and models the types of questions, and then the children go ahead and ask their own questions. and question the author. They're taught to make sure that they understand why the statements are what they are. Maybe that's a little less relevant than things like math, where you don't necessarily question why the Pythagorean theorem works. I mean, you can, obviously, but that's going to work regardless. But in things like certain types of social sciences, obviously, that's much more relevant. For example, the teacher can ask a small group of students some questions about materials they've read, and the students can generate their own questions for the group. This is sometimes known as the flipped classroom model. The flipped classroom model, again, which is kind of a subsidiary of the constructivist idea, although there are differences, is that rather than having the teacher standing up in front of the classroom and say, this is the rule and this is how to do it and everything, then have the students go home and do their homework and do their practice. First you have the students learn the material. Basically, first you have the students watch videos and do some practice on their own, and they come into the classroom already knowing the material, already having learned the material, and the classroom time is used to try to understand why and try to do more practical things and try to build on that knowledge. Again, rather than doing the lesson first and then the homework, do the student lesson on their own by watching the video first, then have the teacher reinforce it and apply it and play games with it and do activities with it, and maybe even have the students do some of the presenting. That's a key part of the flipped classroom model. Okay, now I'm going to put in over here just a quick video about the flipped classroom, and then I'll be back.
The flipped classroom is a new method of teaching that is turning the traditional classroom on its head. Every day, thousands of teachers deliver the exact same lesson in class to millions of students. Every night, millions of students sit over the exact same homework, trying to figure out how to solve it. The flipped classroom is turning this upside down. Traditionally, students listen to lectures and take tests in class, and read textbooks and work on problem sets at home. In flipped teaching, students first study the topic by themselves, typically using video lessons on YouTube, and then apply the knowledge by solving problems and doing practical work in class. Modern schools who flipped their classroom report many benefits. 1. It allows all students to learn at their own pace, as videos can be watched again. 2. It's more efficient, as students enter the classroom prepared to contribute. 3. It enriches the classroom, as more time can be spent on group work and projects. 4. Doing homework in class allows students to help each other, which benefits both the advanced and less advanced learners. Flipping also brings changes for teachers. Traditionally, teachers engage most with the confident students who ask questions. Flipping allows teachers to target the students who really need help, instead of just those who are confident. Also, instead of instructing from the front, teachers guide on the side. This allows them to work more closely with individuals or small groups. Teachers that are not great presenters can use third-party videos to explain the concept and focus on methods of teaching that suit their style, such as project work or experiments. Once video lectures are made available online, teachers don't need to give the same lecture over and over again. Again, they gain more time to focus on the needs of their class. Many scholars also argue that the flipped classroom model promotes equal learning opportunities, as all kids get the same attention when doing their homework. Currently, kids with caring parents, older siblings at home, or expensive private tutors have a clear advantage over those who don't. Let us know what you think. If you were a teacher, tell us if this model would be possible in your classroom. If you were a student, let us know if you would prefer learning in a flipped classroom.
Okay, and I am back. So we are now going to quickly look at the PREMAG principle, which is the idea of increasing less enjoyed activities by linking them to more enjoyed activities. Finish work early so you can go play associates the play with the working hard. This is also sometimes colloquially known as the grandma's law. The grandma's law essentially is that first eat your broccoli, then you can have ice cream. First do 5 math problems, then you can play for 3 minutes on your phone or whatever. Just kind of like mini incentives, micro incentives, where you're giving somebody the ability to do something quickly rather than, and to kind of associate something that would otherwise be unpleasant or boring or tedious with a small reward. There's not that much difference between that and the idea of positive reinforcement, but it is based on the idea of small rewards, just kind of like mentally associating a good thing with something else that is maybe a little bit less good or something that's hard, and getting people to be incentivized to engage in the more difficult behavior because they associate it with something, with a good consequence. That is okay. I'm going to quickly also show you an interesting application of the PREMAG principle to dog behavior and dog training.
Sometimes a dog can get so distracted that becoming a tree is not the best plan. You'll know this if he keeps straining at the end of the leash, ignoring you for quite some time. If this occurs, just turn and walk away. When the dog's attention returns to you, begin rewarding again for loose leash behavior. In this situation, Pico is very interested in getting to her favorite toy. Virginia begins training with her about 20 feet away from the ball to reduce the intensity of the distraction. During the approach, Pico is rewarded when the leash is loose. Anytime she starts to forge ahead, Virginia turns away and adds more distance, rather than nagging her for attention. Notice she does not jerk on the leash. Since she's only providing a couple feet of slack on the leash, Pico really has no choice but to follow when she turns away. The turns are repeated as needed until Pico realizes her forging attempts never pay off. However, when she maintains a loose leash, even when close to the ball, she's given permission to get it, which is a powerful life reward.
Okay, now we're going to apply that to a concept that we discussed a little bit earlier, and that's the idea of adapting to disability. And this idea is the intellectual disability versus the adaptive behavior. Intellectual disability in general just means the inability to do something. Now, somebody could be, of course, very smart, but just have an intellectual disability with regard to a particular type of activity. There are some people who are very smart from a street smart perspective and just have a lot of difficulty when it comes to math, or something to that effect. Some people have trouble mechanically. Some people could be very smart, book smart, and then not be able to use a screwdriver or a hammer or build something. So intellectual disability is just disability characterized by significant limitations in intellectual functioning. Adaptive behavior tries to compensate for that. A person could simply stop studying, or they could maybe study a little bit more on particular topics, or focus on skills that they do have strong suits for. One of the ideas for disability in general in the last few years, rather than just diagnosing him, we're always trying to look for ways to adapt to the disability and try to make the best of what the person's skills are. A few other points regarding educational theory. Number one, the idea of the backwards planning strategy. I've engaged in this many times. Sometimes you first have to understand what your goals are. And the first thing in developing a course is always writing the course goals or the course outcomes. What is it that you want the student to be able to do once the course is over? Do you want the student to be able to do calculus? Do you want the student to be able to fix a car? Do you want the student to be able to bake a cake? Whatever the case may be, you want to look at the outcomes first. Then once you establish the outcomes, a good next step might be to write your final exam, whether it be practical, like having them bake a cake, or a paper-based exam. Writing the exam can actually help develop the course because now you know what your materials have to focus on. Now, you don't just want to teach to the test. You don't want to have an entire course that does absolutely nothing but tell the students precisely what they need to know in order to do in the test. That's not such a great learning experience. But designing the test first at least allows you as the course developer to kind of keep your eye on the ball and figure out what it is you're doing. The expectations is also a key aspect of teaching, because low expectations are a self-fulfilling prophecy, based on the idea if you think that the students are going to do badly and your affect and demeanor and illustrates to the students that you think that they're going to do badly, they probably will do badly, because they don't think that you have any confidence, and why should they work hard to justify your confidence if you don't have any confidence? Teachers who have low expectations may cause students to not perform well. The same thing is true when you're talking about the social class of a person. A person may go to school with the expectation that because his family has always done badly in school and his older brothers, older sisters have done badly in school, well, there may be a kind of an expectation that this person isn't going to do well in school, and that unfortunately could cause a kind of a cycle. The next issue is Vygotsky. Vygotsky is something we looked at before, because Vygotsky is basically one of the things that he's famous for is the constructivist theory of learning, which we already covered. But there are some other important things that are relevant that Vygotsky used in determining some of these important educational concepts. First of all, one of Vygotsky's things that he used was the idea of this zone of proximal development, which is a method of instruction that a child is able to perform tasks with assistance from a more knowledgeable person. Now, that more knowledgeable person may be a teacher, that more knowledgeable person may be another student. Mediation is the first step, and that is helping the learners, breaking down skills, breaking down knowledge, breaking down concepts. The teacher is the agent that breaks things down in a manner that the student is able to comprehend and able to learn from. That's the most basic level of any teaching tool. The first thing you have to do is you have to be able to break down what the student needs to know. Once you've done that mediation level, mediation means like a mechanism by which something is transferred over. It's mediated from one person to another, and that's just the giving, the intergenerational or scholastic giving of concepts from one to another. Then you have the scaffolding. The scaffolding is the idea of building on a solid foundation. You have to have that foundation first. Think of a scaffold as when you build up to one point and then you're building a window or building a building higher than a particular area. You have to build a platform, and then once you build that platform, you can get on top of that platform and you can build further up. So that is the idea of scaffolding, where the assistance is provided by more competent peers or adults, not necessarily by teachers, not necessarily by lecturers, not necessarily by people who are just giving over information, but the idea of people who might be your peers, might be people who are other core classmates, or people who are sharing the same kind of learning experience, can help build through. You've all established a platform of understanding or learning, and now you can move up by getting on top of that scaffold and getting on top of that idea to kind of reach the next level. And finally, you reach the level of cooperative learning. Is the idea of children or even adults can help one another learn. We've discussed many different things about cooperative learning environments, but establishing an idea where peers are able to teach each other is certainly something that would be that highest level of education. Just the original, you have to get the basics, and the way to get the basics is the mediation level, where people are given over information from teachers. The second is, okay, you've built a foundation. Now you need to be able to build on top of that foundation to get the people the skills necessary. And then when you've reached that level, now through cooperation and through learning with other people and with peers, you can really establish the ultimate learning, which is this idea of cooperative learning. This is connected to the zone of proximal development idea that I just mentioned. It's not on the slide, but as I mentioned before, based on the idea that you have to be able, the best way to learn is by interacting, and the best way to learn is by dealing with other people, dealing with peers, dealing with friends. But you have to be able to establish that level. So the first level, you're getting mediation, you're getting taught things, because at that point, being able to learn from other adults really is beyond the 6-year-old's ability. Even sitting in a lab, and even if you're 25, sitting in a lab and learning from other people in the lab may be beyond your level if you haven't had basic chemistry. So first you need that idea is people need to give you that information. Then you can move to the next level of scaffolding. You've had a basis, and now you can use that basis to build on and build further skills and build further knowledge. Once you've reached that high enough level where now you can interact with society at a particular point, or the experts in a lab and in a scientific field, or sports team if you've gone a certain level of skill in baseball or whatever. Now you're on that level where you can really take advantage of all of the learning resources, which is everybody around you that's engaging in the activity that you want to become better at. And to illustrate this, I am going to also post a little video over here about Vygotsky and scaffolding to hopefully illustrate this point.
So, you want to know a little more about scaffolding and the zone of proximal development. The terms were first associated with a theorist called Vygotsky. Vygotsky believed that knowledge is constructed through social interaction with family, friends, teachers and peers. The people who help us learn are our most knowledgeable others, or MKOs for short. The process by which we learn is through focusing on themes that are within our zone of proximal development. So, what is this zone of proximal development? Look at it this way. There are 3 zones. The first is what we already know. If all your teacher were doing in class was in this zone, you might become easily bored because it's something you can already do independently. In contrast, if your teacher pitched content far too high for you to achieve, even with help, you would probably give up and your self-confidence would suffer. These 2 zones are either side of the target zone, called the zone of proximal development. If your teacher or MKO pitched material within this zone, you might find it difficult and challenging, but with their help, you would succeed. Of course, as you progress, your ZPD will move forward, allowing you to tackle progressively more complex topics. Next, we'll look at scaffolding. So, what is scaffolding? Scaffolding is just the support your most knowledgeable other will use within the zone of proximal development to help you achieve your aims. It consists of a number of different principles. Firstly, building interest in the subject and engaging the learner. Secondly, breaking the task into smaller chunks for the learner. Thirdly, focusing the learner on the subtasks, but keeping them interested in the main task. And finally, supporting by modelling ways of completing the task so that learners can internalise it. So, finally, how would you use all of this in your classroom? Firstly, check your students' prior knowledge to find out where their zone of proximal development is. You could also use peer knowledge and experience to help support the others. And remember to break down the main task into smaller stepping stone tasks which will help them achieve the main task. Have high expectations of your students and always try and stretch and challenge them to further their zone of proximal development. And finally, always try and put in place mechanisms to support or scaffold as your students build on their own knowledge. I hope you now have a clearer understanding of this theory. Good luck!
And now, unfortunately, as we get late in the course, we start to look at things that are problems with the educational system and educational psychology. And first, we have the idea of the risk for school dropouts. Now, I think school dropout rates are a little bit lower than they used to be, which is a good thing. But there are certain earmarks or certain hallmarks of dropouts that occur when we do see dropouts. First of all, dropouts impact success, including academic failure. Poor school attendance are things that cause people to drop out. They don't think they're doing well, and they haven't been coming anyway, and they fail courses, and they figure they have nothing to lose by dropping out because they're not going to do well anyway. And the problem, of course, with dropouts is that they condemn themselves, not always, but sometimes, to low-level occupations, unemployment, poverty. People don't have a high school degree. They could become successful entrepreneurs and make billions of dollars. That's always possible, but it's not that likely. People who drop out of high school are... Yeah, so it definitely increases the possibility. Not having a college degree, not having a high school degree, obviously increases these risks. To avoid that risk, one of the things that schools can do is afford more individual attention. Certainly, people that feel that the school cares for them are less likely to drop out. A high status role with the school. Sometimes students who are struggling may be given roles like running general organizations, running student bodies, running clubs, things like that. Even if they don't have necessarily the academic wherewithal, they can be given a place in which they will be confident enough to enjoy the environment and like the environment. Primarily, people leave because just they have trouble with the environment and they have trouble fitting in. And of course, assistance with academic deficits and recovery of missing credits that may be needed for graduation is a system that is really critical to make sure that everybody goes onward and upward. And the next, really a very related concept, is the concept of bullying. Bullying is something that causes people to dislike the environment, want to leave the environment, and causes a decrease in academic success. And cyberbullying is, of course, a particularly important concept today because it's something that's been made so easy. It's so easy to spread rumors, lies, pictures, insults anonymously on things like Facebook and things like Instagram and various other sources online. And it becomes, you can actually bully somebody without even having to reveal your identity, and it's the sort of thing that, and certainly without having to face the person. In the old days, you wanted to bully someone, you actually had to look them in the eye, which is a little harder. Now you don't have to look them in the eye; you just can do it from your Facebook account. That's obviously a major problem, and there are ways in which these things can be investigated. And so, even if people are doing it anonymously, there are ways. Certainly, people can be caught, and it's one of the reasons why you see schools are able to institute these no tolerance or harsh crackdown measures on people who are bullying other students. Of course, what you would like to do is to obtain the email address or obtain the identifying information of the bully. That's the first way to really enforce. And of course, you can change your own information to try to, for example, if there's a bully that's a Facebook friend of yours, you can get a new account and hopefully the bully won't follow you. Things like establishing the identity is, of course, necessary, and it's the sort of thing that if schools don't crack down on cyberbullying, they may subject themselves to problems with complaints with school boards, even lawsuits. Certainly there have been many lawsuits that have been brought by children who have been bullied by other children because the school failed to take appropriate remedial actions. And again, something also we touched on before a little bit, the dangers of a preconceived attitude, the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect somebody to fail, you expect somebody to misbehave, and that somehow gets conveyed, which it very often does, that could cause the anticipated problem to actually happen. The other side of the coin is learning together and team building. These are ways to avoid many of those problems, and these are the concepts that we've discussed many times and their importance. Learning together emphasizes teamwork, which involves working in different groups, heterogeneous groups, meaning groups that come with different skills and perhaps even from different backgrounds and from different knowledge points, and can contribute different skills to a team project. And If that is done appropriately and everybody contributes to the extent that is fair to everybody else, and they hand in a single completed assignment and receive rewards based on group product, that emphasizes and builds the idea of teamwork. And a lot of the things that we have now, really between now and the end, are really just kind of a lot of reviews of what we've already discussed in various contexts, again, just to illustrate specific key points that may be relevant to the exam. Applying behavior analysis techniques means it has certain steps, and now analyzing behavior in order to change it includes identifying the target behavior and what you are using to control it, either to use negative reinforcement or to use positive reinforcement. Establish a baseline for a target behavior. It may not be realistic, for example, to have this particular student study for 5 hours a day or 2 hours a day even, or 1 hour a day even, but there may be some sort of a baseline, what you consider at least acceptable under the circumstances, and that may vary from individual to an individual. And then you can choose a reinforcer, a positive reinforcer, a negative reinforcer, an incentive, some sort of incentive that you think the student will be likely to respond to. Observing behavior during the implementation obviously is important. You want to say, okay, we've incentivized this person to study a half an hour a day by applying this particular reward. If it happens, okay, what has actually happened? It may not be possible to get a precise litany of results and precise explanation of what's happened, but you can get as good a data as possible. When you're running an experiment and it's in a controlled environment, very often you can get precise numbers. If it's a real life scenario and somebody's not totally under your thumb 24 hours a day, you might not be able to get precise results, but you can still get general results. And then, of course, once the behavioral management program is working, you can reduce the episodes of the reinforcement, at least to the extent that you're not completely unwinding whatever good you did, but hopefully the person's inertia in study habits and schoolwork and attendance and whatever it is you're trying to incentivize, hopefully that person's inertia will now be there so that you can kind of decrease the overall incentive pool, but you may have to re-increase it if need be, depending on what happens. The idea that a quiet class is a learning class is something that we're kind of ingrained in, especially in the old model of the classroom lecturer. That is not necessarily true, especially under modern thinking, where the idea that people's contributions are considered a key fundamental component of the learning process, which is something that we discussed before in Vygotsky and a whole bunch of other theories that we learned. The problem with that idea is that teachers can be so concerned about getting students to stay quiet that they lose sight of the fact that they're causing people to go into shutdown mode. And rather, if you say, don't call out, well, then a student may be less likely to become engaged when there is a discussion that requires a little bit of calling out. The idea that just because the class is quiet doesn't necessarily mean that the class is learning. And I've been a teacher for many times, and that's something that I know. Just because the students aren't saying anything doesn't mean that they're with you. You have to have a balance. You can't have 40 people calling out all at once, then it'll be total chaos. But if you have a situation where there's a controlled level of interactivity and discourse, that sometimes can be a better learning environment than one where nobody says anything. Schema or schemata is a concept that we discussed before, a pattern of thoughts or behaviors that organizes information or relationships among them. Again, a mechanism by which somebody thinks about something in order to promote, encourage, or carry out a behavior or a plan. And finally, we have the idea of behavioral learning theories. In other words, the connection between the ability to learn and various behaviors. This is covered more in other courses, things like human growth and development, things like introduction to psychology, but it's also, of course, relevant to to educational psychology, and that is that stimuli cause reflective behavior. Stimuli is something in the environment. A bright light shines, you close your eyes. That's, well, more of a reflex, but the light in that case would be the stimulus. The idea of Pavlov and classical conditioning, again, it's covered much more in other courses, but the idea that you can associate certain things with other behaviors. The famous Pavlov experiment was where every time the doorbell rang, the dog was given some food, and eventually the dog started salivating when the doorbell rang, even though the salivation itself really was a reaction to the anticipated food, even though it had nothing to do with the actual doorbell. Then, of course, there were studies of the relationship between behavior and consequences and the idea of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is conditioning that occurs through reward and punishment and incentives, just like a lot of the things that we've discussed throughout this course. The idea that, again, adding recess was a simple basic reinforcer that might stimulate a class to do better in a particular area. And again, that can be in the form of positive or negative reinforcements. The general idea of an effective learning environment are strategies that A, encourage behavior that's conducive to learning, not distracting other people, focusing, paying attention, doing work when it's relevant, then keeping students interested and engaged, which is another mechanism to prevent misbehavior. People who are engaged and want to learn the material are going to be a lot less likely to engage in mischief than people who are just looking forward to the bell ringing. And creating an effective learning environment, which are establishing techniques that the students can effectively understand the material from. All those three things combined have the effect of creating an effective learning environment. Then we have the different levels of instructions. Tutoring is a different kind of instruction from lecturing in front of a classroom. Peer tutoring is the idea is you have people who may not necessarily be on different levels academically or different levels of knowledge. Even though they may be at the same level, you may think they can't necessarily teach each other because one doesn't know any more than the other. They may have slightly different points of knowledge. One may know more than the other on one particular point, and also they may be able to reinforce their ideas by studying together. Two people that studied together, and they may be able to, if one is not sure about something, but learning the other person shares that idea, is a mechanism by which we can improve their ability to comprehend and process, think about, and develop information. Cross-age tutoring is the idea is you have older children tutoring younger children, another very common mechanism by which to do it. Seventh grader may still be in the educational process, but that doesn't mean the seventh grader can't teach a second grader how to read. And then, of course, you have tutoring by teachers, which is a very effective instructional strategy, although it sometimes tends to be fairly expensive. But the advantage of that, of course, if you have somebody who is the educational professional and you have somebody who then has the time and the wherewithal to give the individual attention that may be necessary for the particular child to be able to pick up the information. Task solving includes understanding the problem, attacking the problem systematically, and arriving at a reasonable answer. Again, just those three processes, fairly self-explanatory, and we've discussed various methods by which each of these can be done throughout this course, but understanding the problem is always the first aspect to solving a problem. Systematically attacking the problem means looking at it, okay, what are the elements of the problem? A particular student isn't behaving. Well, okay, that's the problem, but is it because the student is suffering from hyperactivity? Or is it because the student is disinterested? Or is it because the student has low self-confidence? Or is it because the student is having other problems? Whatever it is, you need to be able to figure out specifically what are the elements of the problem, and that only then can you really arrive at a reasonable answer. And finally, we can look at test validity. And again, another concept that we've covered before is that we can use results to infer whether a particular test is a good test. For example, if a test is being selected to help determine which students are likely to have some difficulty, then we have to look and see, okay, does this test predict academic performance? You know, you may have, for example, an entrance exam to a school, and Now, you may not be able to test its validity in the first year because you may not have a sample size, but after 10 years, if you're given the same entrance exam, it might be time to go back and reassess it by looking, okay, did this entrance exam results actually predict success? You know, you look back at the students who did in the top 10th, let's say the students who got in the 90th percentile or higher, the people who got 95s on the exam, let's say, how did they do? Did the people who got 95s on the entrance exams do really well in the school, or did people who got 95s on the exams, some of them did well and some of them didn't do well? And you can compare it to the other percentiles. For example, you can break up the scores into 10 groups, the highest being the 10th and the lowest being the first, over the course of the past 10 years, and then you can look and see, okay, did the 6th group do better than the 3rd group? If the 3rd group did better than the 6th group, and the 10th group did 5th best, and the 1st group did 4th best, and it was just kind of a hodgepodge where there was no relationship between the performance on the entrance exam and the performance in the school, you may draw the conclusion that this is not really a very valid indicator of success. And of course, realizing that nothing is going to be foolproof, you're not going to have a situation where everybody that did better and how well you did on the entrance exam precisely correlates to how well you do in the school. You can use at least statistical methods to make a determination of whether there is a significant statistical relationship between doing well on the entrance exam and doing well on in the course itself. And this is routinely looked at, by the way, with organizations like the people who write the SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the LSAT, the CPA exam. There are certainly various ways in which you can look at these exams, and they're constantly being tested and say, okay, you know, how well did they correlate with how well the students did once they actually got into college, once they actually got into law school, whatever the case may be. And it's something that schools should do also. If they give a particular exam routinely for a particular course, well, then maybe they should, once they have a big enough sample size, it pays to do some assessment and make sure that the results bear out the validity of the test. Okay, so thank you for listening, and good luck on the exam.